When we last left off, we clarified that the Dark Ages was not portrayed in an inherently true manner. And instead, while Europe was fragmented by the fall of Rome, other parts of the world were alive with trade and innovation. The story of human civilization didn't stop, it shifted from Europe to what we know now as the East. And now that the spotlight has shifted to the East, we look at the heart of Mesopotamia. At a crossroads of empires, a city would rise that would become the most dazzling intellectual capital the world has ever seen. A city where knowledge was not just preserved, but expanded upon, where scholars gathered from every part of the known world to translate, experiment, and dream. This city was the city of Baghdad. At its heart stood Beit al-Hikmah, or the House of Wisdom. The House of Wisdom, however, didn't just appear out of thin air. It was a product of centuries of movement, armies, traders, travelers, theologians, and scientists. To understand how Baghdad became the center and beacon of the world's knowledge, we first have to trace back to the road that led there. And like I mentioned in the last video, this story begins in 7th century Arabia and with the expansion of Islam. Within a single century post Prophet Muhammad's death, ﷺ, the Islamic world stretched from Spain to the Indus River in the east. Empires rose quickly, and with them came an exchange of ideas, languages, and technologies. The Rashidun Caliphate established the foundations, followed by the Umayyads, who moved the capital to Damascus. And under their rule, Arabic became a language not just of faith, but a language of administration and scholarship. Suddenly, vast populations from Egypt to Persia found themselves communicating through a shared tongue, something that didn't really happen before. And it was more than just politics. It was the first building blocks of an intellectual civilization. And with that language came a deeply rooted Islamic tradition known as the pursuit of ilm, or knowledge. The Quran itself repeats constantly to its believers to reflect, to ponder, and to observe the signs of creation. Prophet Muhammad ﷺ is remembered saying that to seek knowledge is of the utmost importance. And whether or not these phrases were literal, the spirit was clear. Knowledge was a sacred pursuit and a path to understanding both the divine and the world he created. This cultural emphasis meant that scholars, translators, and teachers were not just fringe figures. They were respected, often supported, and sometimes even directly employed by the rulers of these specific empires. And at the same time, geography played its part, with the early caliphates inheriting territories with rich, ancient traditions. In Egypt, remnants of Pharaonic, Hellenistic, and Christian scholarship still survived. In Persia, the wisdoms of Zoroastrian priests and Sessian administrators was preserved in archives. And from Byzantium, the Greek manuscripts in philosophy, medicine, and mathematics flowed across the borders. And further east, India's advances in astronomy, mathematics, and medicine awaited discovery. Then came a technological breakthrough, which is paper. And in 71 CE, after the Battle of Talis, Muslim forces captured Chinese paper makers. And unlike parchment or papyrus, paper was so cheap and durable and easier to produce. Within decades, paper mills had spread across the Islamic world, and books, which were once a rare treasure, became relatively abundant. Learning could now spread on a scale that the ancient Greeks or Romans couldn't have even imagined. Meanwhile, cities like Bursa, Kufa, and Damascus became early centers for theological and philosophical debates. In Bursa, scholars wrestled the question of free will and divine justice. In Kufa, grammarians codified Arabic as a precise, scholarly language. These cities served as incubators, places where intellectual traditions began to crystallize. So by the mid-8th century, when the Abbasid dynasty seized power of the Umayyads, the conditions were set. The Abbasids promised a new era, one that moved the capital far more east, far away from Damascus, toward the heartlands of ancient Mesopotamia. They envisioned not just a political center, but a cosmopolitan city that would embody the power and prestige of their empire. This city was Baghdad. Founded in 762 CE by Khalif al-Mansur, Baghdad was carefully planned as a circular city. It was symbolically known as the City of Peace. At its center stood the Khalifa's palace and mosque, and it was surrounded by layers of markets, homes, and gardens. Roads radiated outward like spokes of a wheel, connecting the city to the outside world. And it is here, in this new vibrant capital, that knowledge would find its most ambitious home. Within a few decades, Baghdad was not just a political capital, but a beating heart of intellectual revolution. And at the center of it all was the House of Wisdom. When the Abbasids rose to power in 750 CE, they were not just overthrowing the Umayyads, they were rewriting the map of the empire. The Umayyads had ruled from Damascus, but for the Abbasids, the city symbolized the old order, too close to Syria, too rooted in the Arab elite who dominated the early caliphate. They wanted something different, something that reflected their broader, more cosmopolitan empire. The site they chose was deliberate. By placing their capital in Mesopotamia, the Abbasids were sending a clear message. This dynasty is not just Arab, it is universal. So by 762, Khalif al-Mansur ordered the construction of the city of Baghdad. Chroniclers say that he personally oversaw the project, choosing the circular design that gave the city its nickname, Medinat al-Salam, or the City of Peace. This city's geometry was striking. It was a perfect circle with massive walls and 4 gates facing the cardinal directions, each gate connected to a major road. And by the 9th century, Baghdad was the beating heart of the Abbasid Empire, and arguably the entire world. It boasted hospitals, schools, observatories, and palaces. Poets and scholars thrived under the Khalifa's patronage. The city became a living symbol of what the Abbasids wanted to be remembered for, not only as conquerors, but as cultivators of civilizations. And nowhere was that more visible than their passion for knowledge. Al-Mansur himself, though remembered as a stern and pragmatic figure, was fascinated by astronomy and medicine. He commissioned translations of Indian and Persian texts, laying the foundations for what could become the Abbasid intellectual project. Later rulers like Harun al-Rashid, and especially his son al-Mamun, would carry that flame even further, until Baghdad became not only a political capital, but an intellectual capital. But before you begin to build the knowledge, you need to know what's already out there. The Abbasids understood this very deeply. If they wanted Baghdad to be the center of science and learning, they had to gather the wisdom of the past. This effort became known as the Translation Movement, a vast centuries-long project of cultural preservation and intellectual exchange. It began modestly under Al-Mansur, who had works on astronomy and medicine translated from Sanskrit and Middle Persian. And under Harun al-Rashid, and especially under his son Al-Mamun, it exploded into something quite unprecedented. Al-Mamun, who began to rule from 1813 to 833, is often remembered as the Khalifa of Reason. He believed deeply in the power of human intellect to uncover truth. He dreamed of the potential of what Baghdad would soon become. Under his patronage, teams of translators scoured the empire and beyond, just for manuscripts. They wanted as many as they could find. They brought back Indian works on mathematics, Persian treatises on kingship and ethics, and most famously, Greek scientific and philosophical texts. And these weren't just sitting there waiting to be taken. They were sometimes seized as war prizes. Other times they were obtained through diplomacy, and one famous story tells of Al-Mamun concluding a peace treaty with the Byzantine emperor, in which he demanded not land or gold, but of books, rare Greek manuscripts from imperial libraries. To the Abbasids, knowledge was treasure, and it was as valuable or even more valuable than any jewel. The translators themselves came from many backgrounds. Nestorian Christians, Zoroastrian Jews, and Muslims all collaborated. One of the greatest was Hunayn ibn Ishaq, who was a Nestorian Christian physician who was fluent in Syriac, Greek, and Arabic. He translated hundreds of medical texts, including nearly an entire corpus of Galen. But Hunayn didn't just translate them word for word. He compared the different manuscript traditions, corrected errors, and even produced versions that became more reliable than the originals themselves. Later, his works would travel and shape European medicine for centuries. Other scholars translated works of philosophy, including Aristotle, Plato, and Plotinus. But translations were not just the end of the story. These scholars debated, critiqued, and added their own commentaries. And by the time a text went through Syriac into Arabic, it had been transformed, and not just linguistically, but intellectually. This was more than preservation, it was synthesis. The Abbasids were not simply curators of knowledge, they were builders of a new intellectual tradition. And all this tradition, it needed a home. It needed a place where the manuscripts could be stored and studied and debated. And that home was Beit al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom. The House of Wisdom was not simply an institution. It embodied a radical idea that learning was a collective endeavor, capable of transcending borders, faiths, and generations. What unfolded within these walls shaped intellectual foundations of the world as we know it today. And at its core were translators and scholars who formed the first wave of interconnected global academic communities. Hunayn ibn Ishaq, as I mentioned earlier, was a towering figure in the translation movement. His method was revolutionary. Rather than rushing through texts, he consulted multiple manuscripts and compared them carefully. He revolutionized medical scholarship. Hunayn translated more than 100 works of Galen, making Greek medicine available to Arabic readers. But more than that, he trained a whole generation of translators, ensuring that Baghdad could have the pipeline of multilingual scholars. Philosophy and ethics flourished alongside mathematics, and Al-Kindi was a revolutionary figure. Al-Kindi came from an Arab noble family, and unlike Hunayn or Al-Khawarizmi, Al-Kindi's passion was in philosophy. When the Greek works of Aristotle and Plato entered Baghdad, many saw them as strange and even threatening. What did pagan Greek philosophy have anything to do with Islam, is what they questioned. But Al-Kindi believed that all truth, no matter its origin, was part of a single divine reality. If something was true, if it did not contradict revelation, it could only deepen it. He argued that philosophy and religion were not enemies, but allies. In one of his most famous writings, he declared, "We should not be ashamed to acknowledge truth from whatever source it comes to us, even if it is brought to us from former generations or foreign peoples. For him who seeks truth, there is nothing of higher value than truth itself." Al-Kindi was more than a philosopher. He was also a scientist, working on optics, music, astronomy, and medicine. He experimented on cryptography, and he even developed a system describing music mathematically, linking sounds to numbers. But what made him pivotal was his ability to bridge worlds. He was the first thinker to articulate a distinctly Islamic philosophy that could integrate Greek reason with Quranic faith. For this, later generations coined him the philosopher of the Arabs. He argued that studying natural philosophy and metaphysics did not contradict spiritual beliefs, but it complemented it. By engaging with Greek manuscripts and integrating them into an Islamic worldview, Al-Kindi encouraged critical thinking while honoring moral and religious frameworks. His work became a cornerstone for later Islamic philosophers and influenced European thought during the Renaissance. The Abbasid caliphs themselves played a pivotal role. Knowledge was considered as valuable as gold or territory. In fact, diplomacy took the form of intellectual exchange. One notable example was with the Treaty of the Byzantine Empire, negotiated not only to secure a peace, but to also gain access to Greek manuscripts. Byzantines, who had preserved much of the classical knowledge that had been forgotten in Europe, became partners in Baghdad's intellectual project. Through these agreements, the Abbasids ensured a continuous influx of texts, creating a bridge between civilizations. This approach highlighted a visionary principle that knowledge was to be a tool of statecraft, a means to strengthening society, and a foundation for an enduring cultural achievement. Diversity was central to the House of Wisdom's success. Scholars of many faiths, Christians, Sabians, Jews, and Muslims, all contributed their unique expertise. Jewish scholars preserved Hebrew texts and shared astronomical knowledge. Christian scholars translated Greek works into Syriac before they reached Arabic. Persian intellectuals added rich traditions in medicine, mathematics, and literature. This inclusivity was not accidental. It was a deliberate recognition that wisdom has no faith or culture. Trade and communication amplified the house's influence. Baghdad's position at the crossroads of the Silk Road allowed for ideas, manuscripts, and scholars to travel freely. Caravans brought rare texts from India, charts from China, codices from Byzantium. Scholars responded with commentaries, translating the text, adding corrections, and sending copies to libraries and institutions across the Islamic world. From Damascus to Cairo to Cordoba, knowledge flowed outward as much as it flowed inward, establishing the House of Wisdom as a truly global intellectual engine. Beyond the individual scholars, entire disciplines flourished. Algebra, optics, medicine, astronomy, geography, and philosophy advanced rapidly. Ibn al-Haytham's work on optics, for example, established principles of observation, experimentation, and verification long before the European scientific method had emerged. Ibn Sina synthesized Greek medical knowledge with his own clinical observations, creating the canon of medicine, which became became a standard reference in both the Islamic world and Europe for centuries. Knowledge was valued as a communal asset, a gift, and as a responsibility. The intellectual culture cultivated in Baghdad demonstrated that advancement was not solely about the individual geniuses, but about the network of the people working together toward a common goal. And ultimately, the House of Wisdom represents deliberate choices, valuing education, protecting the diversity of thought, encouraging curiosity, and fostering collaboration. I want to get into how these ideas traveled beyond Baghdad to places like Cordoba, Timbuktu, and Cairo, illustrating how the House of Wisdom was not a local phenomenon. It was the heart of a global intellectual movement.